Want to bring in the former counsel of economic advisors under President Obama. Jason Furman is with us. Jason, good to see you this morning. Thanks so much for joining us.
Good to see you.
What's your take on the tax plan that you've heard so far?
Look, we need tax reform. Our corporate rate is too high. The international system is badly broken. But my problem with what we've heard so far is that while it would help with those, it would create a whole new set of problems, namely a large increase in our budget deficit and giving most of the benefits to very high-income households. So it would make one problem a little bit better, make two problems worse.
The debt doubled under President Obama, right, from $10 trillion to $20 trillion.
We had a huge recession that the majority of the increase in the debt was that. There's a lot of legislation to lower the long-term debt, including bipartisan legislation on spending, on taxes, the Affordable Care Act. But, Maria, that's not the issue. The question is, if you want to help our economy now, what's the right way to go forward? Adding $1.5 trillion to the debt is clearly not the right way forward. And this administration's argument that the tax cuts pay for itself is a fantasy. But the Goldman Sachs Economics Department over the weekend said at best this is going to pay for 20% of itself. So instead of $1.5 trillion, the cost is now $1.2 trillion. That's not a whole lot better.
But, Jason, let me ask you about this. Amy Holmes here. Why shouldn't we look at the historical record that when taxes have been cut, government revenue, has gone up? We saw it in the 1920s tax cuts. We saw it with the Kennedy tax cuts. Government revenue went up significantly. Should we just ignore that?
First of all, there's a big difference between a tax cut from a rate in the 90s to 70%, which is what happened under President Kennedy. President Reagan did a big tax cut in 1981. The deficit came in higher than expected, and so he came back and raised taxes by a significant amount to correct that mistake in 1982, raised them again in 83, 84, and 85, and then he said, you know what? Let's sit down with Congress on a bipartisan basis. Let's set the ground rules. Tax reform will be revenue neutral. It'll be distributionally neutral. And that's what he did in the 1986 reform. That's what this president should have done. Congress would have worked with him on it. But instead, he's promising the biggest tax cut in history, which, by the way, is a total lie, at a time when the country can't afford it.
Why is it a lie?
It's a lie because I think cutting the tax rate from about 95% to 70% is a little bit big, which is what President Kennedy did, is a little bit bigger than this. Under President Reagan, the tax rate went from 70% to 28%. That's a little bit bigger than what President Trump is proposing. I don't know any metric under which this is the largest tax cut in American history. But it is too large a tax cut. It's a tax cut that we can't afford. And by the way, the Business Roundtable said we should have revenue-neutral tax reform. The administration, its budget, said revenue-neutral. Mitch McConnell said we can't afford to add to the deficit. This is what they themselves said.
Here's Kevin Kelly.
We've got to get back to this straw man argument saying, listen, we had a recession, so we were able to double the budget deficit from 10 trillion to 20 trillion. That's nonsensical, because we know over the last 5 years we've seen Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, all these costs go up 15%, and they were supposed to be tackled by the Affordable Care Act. And we've got the issue we have is we have an aging population. So in order for us to tackle the deficit, right, shouldn't we get a growing economy and really focus on putting more people's money back in their hands so they can afford health care and they can pay for these deductibles, because we know that health care is blowing up?
Right, first of all, you have your facts wrong. Medicare growth in the last 5 years has been the lowest Medicare growth has been in decades.
15%.
Adjusted for inflation, it's actually fallen, which is really remarkable.
No,
but you're absolutely
15%.
right. You're absolutely right. We need more growth. The question is, how do we get more growth? Goldman Sachs took a look at this plan. It said the growth rate next year would go up between 1 and 2/10. The year after that, it would go up between 1 and 2/10. And after that, it was essentially zero. You don't add to growth by adding a lot to the deficit. You add to growth with revenue-neutral tax reform. That's where the administration started. That's where the House started. But here's what happened. Every time a lobbyist came along and said we don't like an offset, they dropped it. So everything to pay for this plan